The early morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Sarah Henderson pulled into the parking lot of Carter's family diner. The clock on her dashboard showed 5:45 a.m., exactly on time as always. She had worked as the head waitress at the diner for the past 15 years, and being punctual was a point of pride for her. Sarah adjusted her name tag in the rearview mirror, making sure it sat perfectly straight on her blue uniform. At 48 years old, she considered herself one of the pillars of their small town of Millbrook. The diner was her domain, a place where she knew every regular customer by name and could recite their usual orders without missing a beat. The bell above the door chimed as she unlocked it and stepped inside. The familiar smell of coffee and maple syrup lingered from the previous day. Sarah flicked on the lights, watching as the vintage-style dining room came to life. Red vinyl booths lined the windows, and the black and white checkered floor gleamed from the previous night's mopping. "Morning, Sarah," called out Mike from the kitchen. The elderly cook had already fired up the grills, and the sound of sizzling butter filled the air. "Ready for another busy day?" "You know it, Mike," Sarah replied, tying her apron with practiced efficiency. The morning rush waits for no one. As she went through her opening routine, Sarah thought about how things had changed, and hadn't changed, in Millbrook over the years. The town had stayed mostly the same, which was exactly how she liked it. The same faces, the same families, the same comfortable predictability that made her feel secure in her position at the top of the local social hierarchy. The first customers began trickling in around 6:30 a.m. Sarah greeted each one with a rehearsed smile, though some got warmer welcomes than others. There was Tom from the hardware store, Martha who taught at the elementary school, and old Mr. Jenkins who always ordered 2 eggs over easy with extra crispy bacon. "Your usual, Mr. Jenkins?" Sarah asked, already writing down his order. "You know me too well, Sarah," he chuckled, unfolding his newspaper. By 7:30 a.m., the diner was filling up with the regular breakfast crowd. Sarah moved between tables with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they belonged. She took special pride in knowing which customers preferred their coffee topped off without asking, which ones needed extra napkins, and which ones were best left alone with their thoughts during their morning meal. The sound of cheerful conversation filled the air, mixed with the clinking of cutlery and the occasional burst of laughter. Through the large windows, Sarah could see more cars pulling into the parking lot. The morning rush was in full swing. "Order up," Mike called from the kitchen window, sliding out 2 plates of steaming pancakes. Sarah delivered the plates to a young couple she recognized from church. As she set down their breakfast, she overheard snippets of conversation about changes coming to Millbrook. The town was growing, they said. New businesses were opening up. The hospital was expanding. These whispers of change made Sarah's smile tighten slightly. She didn't like change. Change meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant losing control over her carefully ordered world. She had worked hard to establish herself as a respected figure in the community, and she wasn't about to let anything threaten that position. Little did Sarah know, as she refilled coffee cups and collected empty plates, that this ordinary morning was about to become anything but routine. The comfortable bubble she had built around herself was about to burst, and the carefully maintained walls of her prejudices were about to face their biggest challenge yet. The bell above the door chimed again, and Sarah looked up from her order pad. The customer who walked in would change not only her day but also her entire perspective on life. However, in that moment, all she saw was someone who didn't fit into her narrow view of what belonged in Carter's family diner. Someone she had already decided didn't deserve her service, before they had even taken a seat. Dr. Marcus Thompson wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished his morning jog. At 42 years old, he made sure to maintain his fitness despite his demanding schedule as a cardiac surgeon. He had recently moved to Millbrook to lead the new cardiac unit at Memorial Hospital, a position that came with both excitement and challenges. Looking down at his simple black jogging outfit and Nike running shoes, Marcus decided to grab breakfast before heading home to shower and change for work. He had noticed Carter's family diner during his previous morning runs, and the smell of fresh coffee and bacon had always tempted him. Today seemed like the perfect morning to finally stop in. The bell chimed as Marcus pushed open the door. The diner was busy, filled with the warm buzz of conversation and the clatter of plates. Several heads turned to look at him, some curious, others less welcoming. Marcus was used to being noticed in small towns. As one of the few black professionals in Millbrook, he had already experienced his fair share of subtle stares and whispers. He chose a quiet booth by the window, one that gave him a good view of both the street outside and the morning rush inside the diner. The vinyl seat squeaked as he sat down, and he picked up the slightly sticky menu from behind the napkin holder. The breakfast options were typical diner fare: eggs any style, pancakes, waffles, and various combinations of bacon and sausage. Through the window, Marcus could see the hospital where he would perform 3 scheduled surgeries later that day. He smiled, thinking about how none of his patients ever cared about the color of his skin when he was saving their lives. 20 years of medical practice had taught him that hearts were all the same color on the inside. Sarah Henderson had noticed the new customer immediately. She stood behind the counter, pretending to organize menus while watching him from the corner of her eye. Other servers walked past his table, each assuming someone else would take his order. Sarah had made it clear over the years that she ran the morning shift, and the newer waitresses followed her unspoken rules. Marcus sat patiently, watching the staff move efficiently around him while seemingly failing to notice his presence. He had experienced this behavior before: the careful avoidance, the selective blindness. As a successful surgeon, he could have easily gone to more expensive restaurants, but he believed in not letting others' prejudices dictate his choices. After 15 minutes of being ignored, Marcus raised his hand slightly, trying to catch someone's attention. A young waitress started to move toward his table, but Sarah quickly intercepted her. "I'll handle this," Sarah said sharply, her voice carrying just far enough for Marcus to hear. The diner had grown quieter, with several regular customers watching the scene unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed to be purposefully focusing on their meals, while a few nodded in subtle approval of Sarah's behavior. Marcus watched as Sarah approached his table, her steps deliberate and her face set in a cold expression. He had seen that look before, the one that said he didn't belong here, that his presence was unwelcome. But years of dealing with prejudice had taught him to maintain his dignity and composure. At the counter, James Carter, the owner's son, had just walked in through the back entrance. He was carrying a stack of papers about the hospital's new cardiac center, including the press release announcing Dr. Marcus Thompson's appointment as chief of cardiology. He hadn't yet had the chance to share the news with the diner staff about the distinguished surgeon who had saved his mother's life in Chicago last year. As Sarah reached Marcus's table, neither of them knew that the next few moments would spark a chain of events that would shake the foundations of their small-town social fabric. The quiet breakfast hour at Carter's family diner was about to become a moment that would be talked about in Millbrook for years to come. Sarah stood at Marcus's table, holding her order pad so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She didn't bother taking out her pen or offering the friendly greeting she gave to her regular customers. Instead, she stared at a point somewhere over his left shoulder, refusing to make eye contact. "We're pretty busy this morning," she said coldly. "The wait time for food is pretty long. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." Marcus stayed calm, his hands folded neatly on the table. Years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room had taught him patience. "I don't mind waiting," he replied with a polite smile. "I'll just start with some coffee, please." Sarah didn't move to get the coffee. Instead, she looked around the diner, making a show of checking other tables. "All our coffee machines are having problems today," she lied, even as the smell of fresh coffee filled the air and other customers' cups were being refilled. 2 tables away, an elderly couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. The wife whispered something to her husband, who shook his head sadly, but didn't speak up. At the counter, a teenage waitress watched with wide eyes, clearly disturbed by what was happening, but too intimidated by Sarah to intervene. "That's interesting," Marcus said, his voice steady and professional. "I can see several people enjoying their coffee right now. I'd also like to order breakfast, if you don't mind. I'll have 2 eggs over easy with." "Listen," Sarah cut him off, finally looking directly at him. Her voice was low but sharp, like a knife wrapped in cotton. "I don't know if you're new around here or just passing through, but Carter's has certain standards. We serve our regular customers first, and right now, we're too busy for anyone else." The diner had grown so quiet that the sizzling of bacon on the grill seemed thunderously loud. Mike, the cook, poked his head out from the kitchen window, his face creased with concern. He'd seen Sarah's prejudices surface before in subtle ways, but never this openly. James Carter stood frozen near the counter, the stack of papers about the hospital's new cardiac center still in his hands. He watched the scene unfold with growing horror, recognizing Dr. Thompson from the hospital board meetings. The surgeon's reputation was stellar. He had performed over 1,000 successful heart surgeries, including the one that saved James's mother. Marcus took a deep breath, maintaining his professional demeanor. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "I understand you might have your personal feelings about serving me. However, this is a public establishment, and I have the same right to service as anyone else here." Sarah's face flushed red. "I decide who I serve," she snapped, loud enough now that everyone could hear. "And I'm telling you that you should leave. There are other places that might be more appropriate for your kind." Several customers gasped. A young mother quickly covered her child's ears. Two men at the counter stood up, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but uncertain whether to intervene. Marcus stayed seated, his medical training kicking in as he noticed his own heart rate remaining steady despite the confrontation. He'd faced discrimination before, but rarely this blatant. He thought about all the lives he'd saved, people of all races and backgrounds who had trusted him with their hearts. "My kind?" he asked quietly. "And what kind would that be? A paying customer? A morning jogger? Or is there something else about me that bothers you, Ms. Henderson?" He glanced at her name tag, his voice remaining professional and calm. James Carter finally snapped out of his shocked paralysis. He stepped forward, the papers in his hand suddenly feeling very important. The next few moments would change everything in Carter's family diner, but Sarah didn't know that yet. She was too focused on her own prejudices to notice her boss's son approaching, or to realize that she was about to learn a powerful lesson about judging people based on their appearance. James Carter moved quickly through the silent diner, his footsteps echoing on the checkered floor. His hands trembled slightly as he held the hospital documents. The morning sun streaming through the windows caught the gold lettering on the top page. Memorial Hospital welcomes renowned cardiac surgeon Dr. Marcus Thompson. "Dr. Thompson," James called out, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "I'm so sorry about this misunderstanding. I didn't expect to see you here this morning." Sarah's head snapped toward James, her eyes narrowing in confusion. She knew that tone in James's voice. It was the one he used with the diner's most important customers. "You know this, customer?" Sarah asked, her voice suddenly uncertain. James reached the table and extended his hand to Marcus, who stood to shake it. "Know him?" James said loudly, making sure everyone in the diner could hear. "Dr. Thompson is the new chief of cardiology at Memorial Hospital. He's one of the most respected heart surgeons in the country." The diner erupted in whispers. Sarah's face, which had been red with anger moments before, now turned pale. She took a small step backward, her order pad slipping from her fingers and clattering to the floor. "But more than that," James continued, his voice thick with emotion, "Dr. Thompson is the surgeon who saved my mother's life last year in Chicago. The emergency heart surgery he performed gave my family another chance to be together." Marcus tried to wave off the praise modestly, but James wasn't finished. He placed the hospital documents on the table, showing everyone nearby the impressive credentials and accomplishments of the man Sarah had just refused to serve. 3,000 successful surgeries, James read from the paper. Pioneer of minimally invasive cardiac procedures, named one of the top 20 surgeons in the country. And now he's chosen our town to set up the new cardiac center that will save countless lives in our community. The elderly couple who had witnessed everything were now staring open-mouthed. The wife had tears in her eyes. The teenage waitress behind the counter was typing furiously on her phone, no doubt sharing the story on social media. I didn't know," Sarah stammered, bending down to pick up her fallen order pad with shaking hands. "That's right, Sarah, you didn't know," James said firmly. "You didn't know that Dr. Thompson spends his free time teaching at medical schools. You didn't know that he runs a foundation providing medical care to underprivileged communities. You didn't know that next week he's scheduled to perform life-saving surgery on Mr. Jenkins' grandson." He nodded toward the regular customer who sat stunned at the counter, his coffee forgotten. Marcus remained composed, though his eyes showed a mixture of sadness and understanding. He'd seen this scene play out before, the moment when prejudice collided with reality, when people were forced to confront their own biases. "Please, James," Marcus said gently. "There's no need to. There is every need." James interrupted. My mother would have died if you hadn't been in that Chicago emergency room that night. Your skill and dedication saved her life, and you didn't care what anyone in that operating room looked like. You just cared about saving lives." Sarah stood frozen, the full weight of her actions crashing down around her. The diner that had been her domain for 15 years suddenly felt foreign. Regular customers who had always smiled at her were now looking away in embarrassment or glaring in disapproval. "Dr. Thompson," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I. But before she could finish her sentence, the bell above the door chimed. A local news reporter, who had received a tip from someone inside the diner, walked in with a camera operator. The small-town incident was about to become a much bigger story, and Sarah's world was about to change forever. The local news reporter, Linda Chen, quickly sized up the scene before her. Years of journalism experience told her this was more than just another small-town story. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and the mix of expressions on people's faces, shame, anger, shock, told her something big had just happened. "I got a tip about an incident involving the new chief of cardiology," Linda said, her cameraman setting up behind her. "Dr. Thompson, would you care to comment on what happened here this morning?" Before Marcus could respond, several customers began speaking at once. The elderly woman who had watched everything unfold was crying openly now. "It was horrible," she said. "That poor doctor just wanted breakfast," and Sarah. She couldn't finish her sentence. Sarah stood rooted to the spot, her face ashen. The order pad she had just picked up slipped from her fingers again. The sound of it hitting the floor seemed to echo through the diner like a gunshot. She watched in horror as several customers pulled out their phones, no doubt sharing the story on social media. "Dr. Thompson," Linda pressed, holding her microphone forward. "Is it true you're the surgeon who saved Mrs. Carter's life last year?" Marcus straightened his shoulders, his natural dignity shining through despite his casual jogging clothes. "Yes, I performed emergency cardiac surgery on Mrs. Carter in Chicago," he said calmly. "But I think the real story here isn't about me. It's about how we treat each other as human beings." The cameraman panned across the diner, capturing the uncomfortable faces of the regular customers. Many of them had witnessed Sarah's subtle discrimination over the years, but had never spoken up. Now, faced with the reality of who Dr. Thompson was, they couldn't hide from their own silent complicity. Mr. Jenkins stood up from his seat at the counter, his hands shaking. "My grandson, he's having heart surgery next week," he said, his voice breaking. "Dr. Thompson is going to operate on him. I had no idea. I just sat here and watched. I'm so ashamed." The teenage waitress who had been texting earlier approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. "My mom works at the hospital," she said. "She told me how excited everyone was that you chose our town. She said you're going to train local doctors and help so many people." James Carter stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Dr. Thompson could have chosen any hospital in the country," he announced loudly. "He came here because he believed in our community. He wanted to help build something special at Memorial Hospital, and this is how we welcome him." The news camera captured Sarah's face as she finally found her voice. "Dr. Thompson," she stammered. "I didn't know. I never thought that I could be a doctor." Marcus finished quietly. "That someone who looks like me could save lives, could be worthy of your respect." The diner fell silent. Even Linda lowered her microphone, recognizing the power of the moment. "The heart doesn't care about the color of the hands that heal it," Marcus continued, his voice gentle but firm. "In the operating room, everyone's blood is the same color. Everyone's life is equally precious." Through the window, more news vans were pulling into the parking lot. The story was spreading. Phones throughout the diner buzzed with notifications as social media exploded with accounts of what had happened. Sarah watched as her carefully constructed world crumbled around her. Regular customers who had always supported her were now leaving without finishing their meals. The teenage waitress had taken off her apron and placed it on the counter. Even Mike, the cook who had worked alongside her for years, was shaking his head in disappointment. James turned to the camera, his face set with determination. "This isn't just about one incident or one person," he said. "It's about who we are as a community. And things are going to change at Carter's Family Diner, starting today." By afternoon, the story had spread far beyond the small town of Millbrook. The video of the incident, recorded by several customers on their phones, was playing on national news channels. The diner's phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, while its social media pages filled with thousands of angry comments. Sarah sat alone in the diner's back office, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. Through the window, she could see protesters gathering outside with signs condemning racism. The parking lot was full of news vans, their satellite dishes reaching into the sky like metal trees. Sarah, James Carter said as he entered the office, followed by his father, Bob Carter, the diner's owner. We need to talk about what happened. Bob Carter looked older than his 70 years as he sank into his chair. The diner had been his life's work, a legacy he had hoped to pass down proudly. Now it was making headlines for all the wrong reasons. I never meant for any of this to happen, Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. If I had known who he was. That's exactly the problem, Bob interrupted, his voice firm but sad. You shouldn't treat anyone that way, regardless of who they are. Every person who walks through that door deserves respect. Outside the office, volunteers from local civil rights organizations were handing out flyers. The teenage waitress who had quit earlier was among them, sharing her own stories about the subtle discrimination she had witnessed while working at the diner. The hospital board called an emergency meeting, James said, placing a newspaper on the desk. The headline read, "Prestigious surgeon faces discrimination at local diner. They're worried Dr. Thompson might leave town over this." Sarah's head snapped up, real fear in her eyes. Her son had a heart condition that might need surgery someday. The thought that her actions might drag away the very doctor who could save him hit her hard. What's going to happen to me?" she asked quietly. Before either Carter could answer, there was a knock at the office door. To everyone's surprise, Dr. Marcus Thompson walked in, still wearing his jogging clothes but now accompanied by the hospital's diversity officer and a representative from the local NAACP chapter. "I have a proposition," Marcus said, his voice calm and professional. "Instead of firing Sarah, which many people are demanding, I suggest we use this as a teaching moment." The diversity officer stepped forward, laying out a plan. The diner would temporarily close for staff retraining. Every employee would attend mandatory diversity and inclusion workshops. The diner would partner with local minority-owned businesses and host community discussions about racism. "But that's not all," Marcus continued. "Sarah, I want you to work with us. Share your story. Help others understand how prejudice can blind us to the humanity in each other. Your experience could help prevent similar incidents in the future." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. You want to help me? After what I did?" "Hatred doesn't heal hatred," Marcus replied. "Only understanding and education can do that. I've seen too many hearts stop beating to waste time on revenge. What matters is moving forward and creating positive change." The NAACP representative nodded in agreement. "We're not interested in destroying lives," she said. "We want to transform them, to build bridges where there were walls." Through the office window, they could see more people gathering outside, but now, mixing with the protesters were members of the hospital staff, wearing their white coats and scrubs, holding signs that read, "Hate has no home here," and "Change starts with understanding." Bob Carter stood up, his decision made. "We'll do it," he said firmly. "All of it. This diner was always meant to be a family place, and family means everyone, no exceptions." Sarah looked at the faces around her, the Carters who had trusted her for years, Dr. Thompson who was offering her a chance at redemption, and the community leaders willing to help guide the way forward. For the first time since the morning's incident, she felt something new replacing her shame. Hope. 1 month after the incident, Carter's family diner looked very different. The walls now displayed artwork from local artists of all backgrounds. The menu had expanded to include dishes from various cultures, but the biggest change wasn't visible. It was in the hearts and minds of the people who worked there. Sarah sat in the front row of the community center, listening to Dr. Thompson give a presentation about his journey in medicine. The room was packed with people from all over town, including many of the diner's regular customers. She noticed Mr. Jenkins sitting nearby, holding his grandson's hand. The boy had recovered well from his heart surgery, thanks to Dr. Thompson's skilled hands. "Medicine taught me that we're all the same inside," Marcus was saying, showing slides of different hearts on the screen behind him. "When I'm in the operating room, I can't tell if the heart I'm fixing belongs to a white person, a black person, or anyone else. All I know is that someone needs my help. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. The past month had been the hardest of her life. The diversity training sessions had forced her to confront her deep-rooted prejudices. She had learned about the history of racism, heard personal stories from people of color, and slowly begun to understand the pain her actions had caused. During the lunch break, Sarah approached Marcus with 2 cups of coffee, served exactly the way he liked it, as she had learned during his regular visits to the diner. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving me a chance to learn and change." Marcus accepted the coffee with a warm smile. "Thank you for being willing to change. That's not easy for anyone." The teenage waitress who had quit, Jenny, was now back at work. She had become one of the leaders of the diner's new diversity committee. Sarah watched as Jenny confidently led a training session for new staff members, teaching them about unconscious bias and the importance of treating everyone with respect. "Remember," Jenny told the group, "what happened here wasn't just about one incident. It was about years of small prejudices that we all ignored. But now we know better, and we're doing better." The local news crew was back too, but this time they were covering a positive story. Linda Chen interviewed Sarah about the changes at the diner and her personal journey. "It's not enough to say I'm sorry," Sarah told the camera. "You have to show it through your actions every day." The diner had become a model for other businesses in town. Bob Carter proudly showed visitors the new hiring policies that encouraged diversity. James Carter worked with the hospital to create internship programs for minority students interested in healthcare careers. Sarah's own son had started volunteering at the hospital, inspired by Dr. Thompson's work. He helped transport patients to their appointments and sometimes got to watch surgeries from the observation room. His heart condition was being monitored, but knowing Dr. Thompson would be there if he ever needed surgery gave Sarah peace of mind. "You know what the strange thing is?" Sarah said to Marcus as they watched a diverse group of customers enjoying their meals in the diner. "I thought changing would mean losing something, but I've gained so much more: understanding, friendship, a bigger view of the world." Marcus nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's often how it works. When we open our hearts to others, they grow bigger, not smaller." The bell above the door chimed, and a group of medical students from different backgrounds walked in. They were part of the hospital's new training program, drawn to Millbrook by Dr. Thompson's reputation. Sarah greeted them with a genuine smile, leading them to a table. As she took their orders, Sarah realized something important. The diner hadn't just saved its business by changing. It had found its true purpose. What started as a place that excluded people had become a space where everyone could feel welcome, where healing happened over cups of coffee, and where the community could grow stronger together. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning at Carter's family diner. The autumn leaves were turning golden outside as Sarah prepared for a special celebration inside. The diner was hosting an anniversary event, but not the kind they used to have. This was a celebration of change, of growth, and of community. Dr. Marcus Thompson stood at the counter, helping Sarah hang a banner that read "Community Unity Celebration." The diner was packed with people from all walks of life: hospital staff, local business owners, community leaders, and regular customers. The walls were covered with photos showing the diner's transformation over the past 6 months. "Can you believe how much has changed?" Sarah asked, adjusting her new name tag that now reads Sarah Henderson, Community Relations Manager. "Sometimes it feels like that morning happened in another lifetime." Marcus smiled, remembering how far they'd come. The diner had become a symbol of positive change in Millbrook. Other businesses had followed their example, creating their own diversity programs. The hospital's new cardiac center was thriving, attracting patients and medical professionals from all over the state. Jenny, the teenage waitress who had once quit in protest, was now attending community college part-time, inspired by the events to study social justice. She still worked at the diner, training new staff members about inclusion and respect. "Look who's here," James Carter called out as his mother walked through the door. Mrs. Carter, healthy and strong after her heart surgery, hugged Marcus warmly. "My miracle doctor," she said, patting his cheek. "You didn't just save my heart, you helped save our town's heart too." Sarah's son Tommy ran up to them, excited to share his news. "Dr. Thompson, my latest heart checkup was perfect. And guess what? I got accepted into the hospital's youth volunteer program. The local news crew was setting up in the corner, but this time Sarah wasn't afraid. She had learned to share her story honestly, hoping it would help others confront their own prejudices. Linda Chen, the reporter who had covered the original incident, was now working on a documentary about the diner's transformation. Bob Carter stood up to make a speech, his voice strong with pride. 6 months ago, we had a choice to make, he said. We could have closed our doors in shame, or we could open them wider than ever before. Thanks to Dr. Thompson's forgiveness and Sarah's courage to change, we chose to learn and grow. The crowd applauded as Sarah took the microphone. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was clear. I used to think I knew everything about this town and its people, she said. I had such a small view of the world. But now I understand that true community means everyone. Every single person who walks through that door is family. Mr. Jenkins stood up with his grandson, who now wore a t-shirt that said, Future Doctor, and spent his free time shadowing Dr. Thompson at the hospital. My grandson is alive because this man's skill had nothing to do with his skin color, Mr. Jenkins said. And our community is stronger because we finally learned to see with our hearts, not our prejudices. As the celebration continued, people shared stories of how the changes had affected their lives. The diner had started a scholarship program for minority students interested in medical careers. Local schools were using their story in their curriculum about diversity and inclusion. Even other towns had sent representatives to learn from their experience. Marcus watched it all with quiet satisfaction. He had seen many hearts heal in his operating room, but watching a community heal its divisions was just as rewarding. Sarah caught his eye and smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. The bell above the door chimed, and a new family walked in, looking uncertain. Without hesitation, Sarah walked over to welcome them, her smile growing wider. Welcome to Carter's, she said, where everybody belongs. As the sun set outside, the diner glowed with warmth and laughter. The smell of coffee and fresh pie, mixed with the sound of different languages and accents, creating a symphony of community. What had started as a moment of shame had transformed into a legacy of hope, proving that even the hardest hearts could learn to open, heal, and grow.